Good evening. I'm Bernard Green, Chair of the Brookline Select Board and also Chair of the Select Board Committee on Policing Reforms. The committee was formed along with a parallel task force to reimagine policing in the midst of the torrid turmoil in America and globally caused by the sadistic killing of George Floyd on Memorial Day in 2020. After killings of other Black and brown men and women across the country by police in various parts of our country. These events persuaded the Select Board to charge this committee with looking at the Brookline Police Department to make sure that the department's training, discipline, and operations were sufficient to avoid the misconduct that we saw in other parts of the country. My personal belief is that the Brookline Police Department is a very good department, but not perfect. That belief is reinforced by the work of the committee and the views of leading experts who have given testimony to the subcommittees of this committee. The job of this committee and the town is to create from a not perfect police department, a more perfect police department. At the same time, we must acknowledge that incidents of police violence against Black and brown men and women across the country by police in multiple communities that are captured on cell phone video have traumatized, especially people of color, particularly Black youth, and cast an unfair negative light on all police officers, including those in Brookline. The committee report lays out concrete steps that Brookline can take to create that more perfect police department that we want. I would like to thank everyone that contributed to the success of this project, including committee members, June Binney, who left the committee to become a staff or an expert consultant for us, Elizabeth Childs, former commissioner of the Department of Mental Health, Raj Danda, Casey Hatchett, sergeant in the Brookline Police Department, Jonathan Mandy, who I had to step down from the committee because of family medical issues, Marty Rosenthal, who's a leading trial civil rights lawyer, Robert Sable, who is former director of the Greater Boston Legal Services and also very involved in legal services and related matters across the country. Dwayne Tyndall, Ron Wilkinson, who's the information technologist and an information technologist at Boston Children's Hospital. He's the Senior Business Intelligence Program, Senior Business
Intelligence Program Technologist.
Okay, Senior Business Intelligence Program Technologist. I apologize. I had this stuff written down because I have a computer failure. Paul Yee, a former district court judge, Sasan Zelka, and Michael Zurab, who's a particularly valuable member of the committee because he's actually studying policing for his PhD at Harvard. We've had a number of non-voting expert consultants and staff support for the committee. June Biney, as I mentioned, is now an expert consultant for us and has been extremely helpful. And Hess Braga, who's the Human Resources Director of the town of Brookline. Michael Downey, one of the attorneys in the town council's office. Of course, Devin Fields, who basically provides administrative and other support to all of the meetings that happen online in the town of Brookline. Janice Kahn, who's a let's see, who's a national, let's see, Janice, what, tell me. Social science, has a doctorate in sociology. Michael Keaveney, who's the police union president. Melvin Kleckner, the town administrator. Annabelle Lane, the social worker in the police department. Chris Mallon, sergeant in the police department. Daniel O'Leary, former police chief here in Brookline. Jennifer Pastor, a lieutenant in the Brookline Police Department. Felina Silva Robinson, who's a designee of the Women's Commission to this committee. Richard Chiola, who's a nationally recognized behavioral health expert. And Caitlin Starr, who's designee of the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations to this committee. So those are the people who have actually produced this report. Experts as well as committee members who did an incredible job to create a report that, in my opinion, is going to be very valuable as we make our police department a more perfect police department, and will be something that Brookline will be proud of. It will not stand on someone's or sit on someone's bookcase. Rather, it's going to be consulted and reviewed for many years to come. Kevin, next slide. Okay. So we're going to, in this, before this hearing begins, each of our subcommittees is going to present, first of all, the focus or the purpose of their subcommittee, and then a number of recommendations that we're going to make to the select board for reforms and improving the Brookline Police Department. First of all, though, there are some universal recommendations that have come out of the deliberations of this committee. I'd like to mention just 4 of them. First, that the town give consideration to thinking of public safety as also including the Department of Health and Human Services, because of the intersection of the necessary role the police play in mental health and substance use crises, and the social service responsibilities of the Department of Health and Human Services, including mental health and substance use. Secondly, that the select board appoint a standing committee. I mention this here, even though it will be mentioned also by the Accountability Subcommittee, because the what we're calling the Police Commissioner Advisory Committee, which is designed to provide assistance to the Select Board and facilitate the Select Board in this exercise of its police commissioner role. This committee will be relevant to the recommendations of almost every subcommittee. Every subcommittee will be giving this committee an assignment with respect to their area of focus. So I want to mention that up front. Thirdly, that the select board supports the budget requests that will result from the modest proposals that the subcommittees have proposed that add to the responsibilities of the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, the Police Department, and other departments and agencies of town government. Finally, we recommend or ask that the town administrator prepare cost estimates for the above additional responsibilities, whether they are just additional staff people in the departments, or whether they may include new divisions in, for example, the Health and Human Services Department. So those are 4 universal recommendations. And we're going to start with the recommendations of the various subcommittee, starting with accountability. Let me just mention that after the 5 subcommittees go through their reports, we will then have a brief discussion by members of the committee. And then we'll open it up to the public for their questions and comments. We're not going to have a back and forth, but your questions still can be addressed by the committee either later on as we put together the report, and we are able to email you or talk to you, or will be addressed by the committee at the end of the public comment period. So let's start out with the Accountability Subcommittee, which is chaired by Michael Zurab. Michael, tell us what the purpose of your committee was.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. Together with all the folks whose names are listed here, I served on the Accountability Subcommittee, which has been working hard since September, with the following two objectives in mind. The first is strengthening public input into the operations of the police department. And the second is that ensuring that police misconduct is prevented and corrected. And with these objectives in mind, we had four major areas of focus. The first was the civilian complaints process, which we've spent a lot of time on and will continue to spend time on. We've interviewed folks who filed complaints against employees of the police department, as well as relevant town staff. And we've reviewed the findings of complaints and investigations of those complaints made in the last several years. The second area of focus has been civilian oversight models. So in Brookline, we have the select board who serve as police commissioners. They have formal authority over the police department and making police policies. And so we reviewed different oversight models across the United States, but with particular attention to other communities in the Commonwealth that have created institutions to strengthen civilian oversight. And so we reviewed the models of four communities in particular: Boston, Cambridge, Pittsfield, and Springfield, and their lessons for Brookline, how we can adapt what these other communities have done to strengthen civilian oversight here. A third area of focus has been policies and procedures of the police department, focusing on a culture of peer accountability, officers keeping each other in check and making sure that policing is done in a democratic, legal, and equitable way. And finally, creating additional mechanisms for public feedback beyond just complaints or commendations, finding other ways that the public can provide input into their encounters with the police. So the four main recommendations we have, which are spelled out along with some others in our subcommittee report, are as follows. First, we're interested in the select board forming a police commissioners advisory committee, as Chair Green had mentioned. So this committee would be a standing committee of residents who have no affiliation with the police department. And their goal would be to strengthen civilian oversight of the police department by the select board, to monitor and review civilian complaints, including, as necessary, any appeals of those complaints to the select board, or the need, if any, for an investigation of the complaints by somebody other than the internal affairs officer of the police department, and also to gather input from the public about their perspectives on policing policies, their experiences, and their suggestions. This committee would have a variety of additional functions that we kind of spell out, working with the public and with the police department to ensure, and with the select board to ensure that policing is done effectively and equitably in Brookline. But this is definitely one of the major recommendations that you'll hear about a lot tonight that would, in our view, substantially change how policing is done in Brookline by providing ongoing input from the public. And it would sort of parallel other committees that the select board has to deal with important issues like housing or economic development, where the select board, while maintaining formal authority as the police commissioners of the town, benefits from the expertise and the time of dedicated residents of Brookline with diverse backgrounds and perspectives on how policing is done. The second main recommendation is that there should be a liaison, an independent non-police employee, perhaps from the Office of Diversity, who's available to assist individuals who file complaints against police employees and participate in interviews. And this comes from the fact that filing a complaint against the police department is an intimidating and sometimes confusing process. And individuals doing so might benefit from the help of an independent person who could help them file their complaint and understand and navigate the complaints process, as well as provide a kind of independent set of eyes and ears on the interviews and other evidentiary findings done to investigate those complaints. The third main recommendation has to do with increasing the accessibility of the complaints process, making it easier for people to file complaints and less intimidating to do so. So for example, one thing that we have accomplished already is enabling people to file complaints against police department employees directly through the town website, rather than having to deliver by hand or by mail those complaints to the police department. We're also recommending that people be able to file complaints at locations besides the police department, especially the diversity office. And finally, one of our main recommendations is a customer satisfaction survey, essentially enabling members of the public who encounter the police in some fashion to provide feedback on those encounters. Not just through complaints or through commendations, the kind of extremes of feedback, but on a regular basis, just providing feedback on those encounters, and also hopefully providing feedback that might be helpful to the police department in improving how they do business. And this might be monitored by the police department and Office of Diversity for potential improvements. That's all for us for now. This is spelled out in much more detail in the reports, but I look forward to the feedback we receive from the public.
Great, thank you, Michael. And this is one of the committees whose work will continue for after we make our presentation to the Select Board, have the hearing, which will be March 16th, and the vote by the Select Board on March 30. There's a lot of work still to be done, and we'll continue doing that. Next, we have civil rights, militarization, and mass events. Chair of that by former District Court Judge Paul Yee. Paul? You're muted, Paul.
Thank you, Bernard, for all your time and effort and your leadership in this effort. My name is Paul Yee. I'm chair of this subcommittee. And what we did was to review and examine what are the current policies and procedures and practices of the police department, and see what the results yield and the data from that policies. And also to look at changes that we could recommend to improve the police department. And this is all made and done in light of the new police reform law that the governor just signed at the end of this year. And that law will be phased in stages during 2021. So all of that has gone into what we reviewed. So there are 5 areas that we looked at: racial profiling, as you see. And let me just go through racial profiling, and our report is focused about 2/3 of that in racial profiling. And let me just read you part of what we have stated in the report, and it's important. The subcommittee and also the full Police Reform Committee takes very seriously the issue of profiling, which is at odds with our community's values, and which the Brookline Police Department has taken seriously now for 4 decades, and which is endemic in American communities. While we may never be able to entirely eliminate unconscious bias, we need to keep striving to keep reducing its impact, especially when such an effort would not diminish public safety. Every single incident when a person of color is inappropriately confronted, stopped, questioned, cited, searched, or arrested is not just a serious affront to that person, but it's also an affront to our community. And to the extent such incidents tarnish or our image to those who might otherwise want to come and live here, our community suffers. The Brookline Police Department has been making serious efforts since 1987, especially since 1997 under Chief O'Leary to do so. Yet we still have disparities. We admit that, and we found that, and we need to keep on improving. So the new police reform law has defined racial profiling. Let me just tell you and read it to you. Racial or other profiling shall mean differential treatment by law enforcement officials based on actual or perceived race, color, ethnicity, national origin, immigration, or citizenship status, religion, gender identity, sexual orientation in conducting a law enforcement action, whether it is intentional or evidenced by statistically significant data showing that disparate treatment. The police reform law also declares that all persons shall have the right to bias-free professional policing. And it's defined in the law, the new law, as policing decisions made by and conduct of the law enforcement officials that shall not consider a person's race, ethnicity, sex, gender, sexual orientation, religion, mental or physical disability, immigration status, or socio-economic or professional level. So we went and looked at the three parts, what could be deemed as racial profiling. Basically, traffic stops, field interviews, and arrests. We went through the policies and procedures. All those policies and procedures, we looked at the publicly available data, and that's on the Brookline Brookline town website in the police department. And we also looked at all the publicly available data that has been published by the Brookline Police Department over the years in their annual racial and gender disparities report. Let me just delve into traffic stops, because what the policies and procedures provide for in traffic enforcement is that the officers shall not give preference to local residents or non-residents, but to be consistent and uniform in traffic enforcement. There's also an overall policy in the civil rights section of the police manual that states no officer shall conduct a traffic stop, field interview, or seizure of any person when such action is based solely on that person's race, ethnicity, age, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, economic status, cultural group, or other identifiable affiliation. So that's our stated policy. In each of these areas of traffic stops, field interviews, and arrests, this should be applied. With respect to traffic stops, I'll go into that a little bit more detail. So in 2018, the Brookline Police Department, they issued over 9,000 moving violations. In 2019, there was over 13,000. And in this year, 2020, there was only 3,400 because of the pandemic. We looked at what the traffic accidents in Brookline were. That's publicly available. That was 1,200 traffic crashes in the year 2019. We looked at whether or not the traffic citations were correlated to those accident sites, and we found that it was.
Hey, Paul,
Yes.
you should just summarize this, because your
Okay.
recommendations are really the meat of the
All right.
subcommittee report,
All right. Okay.
and what people are really looking forward to.
So we went through that area, and with respect to the data for field interviews and arrests, they're consistent with the way the traffic stops are. The conclusions we had about racial profiling was there appears to be a pattern that more residents than more non-residents than residents were being subjected to traffic stops, field interviews, and arrests. There appears to be a pattern that Black non-residents represent a disproportionate number compared to white non-residents. That white-Black non-resident disparity does not seem to be present with white residents and Black residents. On the whole, white residents are subject to more field interviews, more arrests than Black residents. With respect to racial profiling, we also looked at the suspicious calls, suspicious activity, and that's where citizens called the police department. There were over 500 calls to the Brookline Police Department in 2019. Half of those calls were not deemed suspicious at all. A lot of those calls did not have sufficient information that were provided by the callers. And because of that, the minority residents and non-residents of the community could be subjected to police interaction.
So,
Also, yeah.
So what are the recommendations of your subcommittee?
So our recommendations was obviously to support the Police Commissioner's Advisory Committee. We identified certain factors that we asked them to identify certain factors that may cause disparity in the treatment of non-residents versus residents. We also are recommending that the police department's capacity to generate data, to monitor and measure and correct disparities be increased. We also have recommended that the benchmark study be updated so that there is a more accurate measure of who the drivers are in the town of Brookline during the day and the night. Because of the new statute in police reform, there has to be an update of the manual with an emphasis on reducing disparities, especially in the use of discretion by the police officers.
Great, thank you, Paul. And I want to sort of emphasize that Paul's report recommends the either hiring of additional personnel or reassigning personnel. I'm sorry, hiring a new personnel or reassigning existing personnel to prepare and produce for the PCAC or other bodies police data that can be used. I mean, data right now is mainly used for policing purposes. So we want to get the police department to compile and release data that gives the community a better sense of what's happening. And this is going to require some additional budget items, which I don't think are significant, but still are going to have to go through the budget process. I want everyone to make sure they spend the time to read the subcommittee reports, especially Paul's subcommittee report. Paul's report is very long, but that's because it has an incredible amount of information in there that is critically important if you want to have any opinion about policing here in Brookline. Same thing about other subcommittee reports, but I just mentioned Paul's report because he just finished it with his recommendation. So next we have community outreach, youth, and non-traditional roles. This is chaired by Sergeant Casey Hatchett. Casey, tell us what the purpose of your committee was to start off.
Good evening, Casey Hatchett. I'm chair of the subcommittee on community outreach, youth, and non-traditional roles. Also on this committee, Bernard Green and Michael Zurab, and we were supported by Janice Kahn, retired Chief Jen O'Leary, and Caitlin Starr from the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations. I'd also like to acknowledge the tremendous amount of assistance that we received from members of the Brookline Police Department who worked hand in hand with this committee and the larger committee to provide educational materials, informational videos, fact sheets, data analysis, testimony, all in an effort of full cooperation and transparency. I'd like to thank my fellow subcommittee members for all their hard work these last 6 months, and I'm amazed by the credentials that Bernard reviewed earlier of this group that he brought together, and I feel that the work and strengths of both our subcommittee and the larger committee have resulted in a comprehensive review and analysis of the complexity of policing today, and I hope that we all feel good about what we've heard and what we've learned and what we're suggesting moving forward, and recommendations, which I do believe represent a fair and thoughtful process and will further promote the police department's commitment to fair and impartial policing practices while strengthening relationships between the police, social service agencies, and the public. Our committee undertook look at various areas of policing work that were deemed as community outreach, non-traditional roles, and we narrowed those down to homelessness, the walk and talk unit, the school resource officer program, crisis intervention, emergency management, and domestic violence. And as I go through what our recommendations are, I'll give a little information about what we learned and what we heard during that process to be able to impact what our recommendations are moving forward. We conducted a survey of BHA residents throughout this process. We reviewed a tremendous amount of information from within the police department, and we listened to the task force subcommittee work that paralleled our work and weighed their concerns and what they heard and learned as well, and putting together our recommendations. And so first, in looking at homelessness, we heard early on from Lieutenant Jen Pastor and Officer Joe Amendola, who is the department's liaison to homelessness currently, and we learned that basically a more robust system needed to be put in place to address the multitude of issues that homelessness in Brookline presents, not just to those who are underhoused, but also to the residents. We learned from Officer Amendola that between August and December, there were no less than 100 calls placed to the police department for assistance, and for one of our homeless individuals who was causing both he was in need of services and also was causing issues regarding public health and sanitation. And what we learned was, although the Department of Public Works has been incredibly helpful with addressing encampments that have come up throughout the town over the last many years, that there really needed to be a more robust program in place to deal with the long-term multidisciplinary issues that are raised by homelessness in Brookline. And so our recommendation would be to establish a multidisciplinary task force to look at the current state of homelessness, how we can better support our underhoused. Many co-present with also mental illness and substance abuse and other issues, and being able to really focus on providing the best services and resources for those individuals, while also being sensitive to the many concerns for quality of life issues that are posed to residents who are fearful of some of the homeless that they've been interacting with, or are concerned about encampments that are set up in their neighborhood. And so we really needed a multidisciplinary approach to that. I'm happy to report, and hopefully the committee votes to accept this recommendation to establish a task force on homelessness. We have gone ahead and done so because we were seeing an increase in homelessness throughout the fall, and really needed to bring a group together. And so we currently have, we've had one meeting. We will be moving forward with additional meetings. We have one scheduled for next week with our homelessness task force, which includes members from the Department of Public Works, Brookline Housing Authority, Brookline Community Mental Health, the Health Department. We have a representative from the library, a constable, the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, Veteran Affairs, and I believe that's all of our representatives, who all are stakeholders and impacted in some way or another with the homelessness issue. We would also recommend that we fund a new staff position to be able to address the issues and manage the homelessness multitude of issues that we're being faced with. And that person, we believe thus far in our discussions, should probably reside in the Health and Human Services Department of the town of Brookline. And whether that's a full or part-time position, but someone who can both do street work and outreach to our homeless, as well as supporting our residents with health and public safety concerns. Michael Zurab has pointed us towards a great program for Portland Luz, which would provide facilities for our homeless, which results in a lot of the calls and complaints that we get from residents from our homeless population. Moving on to our Walk and Talk program. Our Walk and Talk program is a joint partnership that the Brookline Police Department has had with the Brookline Housing Authority for about 30 years. We currently have 3 police officers that are assigned to the Walk and Talk program, and they serve as liaisons between Brookline Housing Authority and the police department and other entities in town. They are reliable, trusted sources of support and assistance for many residents. They service calls for assistance and general calls for service at all 10 of the different BHA properties. And we have heard anecdotally, and then again during a survey that we performed through our subcommittee, heard that these officers that are known and trusted to residents help ensure that the most positive outcomes for residents when dealing with difficult and often delicate situations, both for residents and our youth and adults. We conducted a paper survey of all housing authority households. We sent out 770 surveys. We received back 70 thereabout for a 9% response rate. The attached report has the breakdown of all of the questions and the highlights and the specific data. I will just say that about 85% of respondents who shared their opinion wanted the program to continue. 10% were neutral, and 5 of the respondents did not want the program to continue. Also, about 90% of the senior respondents wanted the program to continue. 3 were neutral and 7 did not. We also learned that Brookline Housing Authority has a 56% elderly housing population, and that was actually news to me. And so I think that that's one area that we'll be looking at going forward if we're meeting the needs of not just our family housing units, but also our seniors. About 90% of the people of color who responded wanted the program to continue as well. 5 were neutral and 5% did not. And there was some great anecdotal information through the survey. Thank you, a huge thank you to Caitlin Starr from the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Relations, who gathered all of the survey responses. It was a paper survey. She did the data entry and the analytics and provided us with a report. And going forward, we'll be conducting follow-ups with respondents as to how they felt about the program and questions. Many of the respondents, although it was an anonymous survey, did choose to leave their contact information, include their contact information, and request a follow-up to be able to talk further about the program. We've heard from the officers in the Walk and Talk program. We were provided with a fact sheet as well as a video where they discuss the work that they do. And moving forward, what we would recommend for the Walk and Talk program is to develop a joint mission statement for the program between BHA and BPD. Having begun 30 years ago, there's very few of us that were around then that can speak to all the specifics of the origin and initiation of the program. As the current supervisor of that program, I do know that we do not have a current MOU or joint statement of missions and goals, and I think that would really strengthen the program. And so I'm glad the subcommittee is in agreement on that. And also, we want to make sure that we're conducting ongoing evaluation and outreach to members of the BHA community to ensure that the Walk and Talk program is meeting the needs of residents. Our society changes, our crime changes, our needs change, and we want to make sure that the program work that our Walk and Talk officers are doing is meeting those needs, particularly our youth and people of color. We will be working with the Teen Center to evaluate the work that our Walk and Talk officers do with youth, and continue going forward to have focus groups and meetings with the Brookline Housing Authority Board, and make sure that that open dialogue is maintained, and that we're trying to make the program as comfortable for everyone who is involved. We also then looked at our school resource officer program. Our school resource officer program in Brookline consists of 4 officers. 3 are assigned to the middle schools, to the 9 eight middle schools, excuse me, in Brookline and one to the Brookline High School. The middle school SROs were always referred to as the DARE officers, and then they were the AWARE officers. What we've learned through this process is that because they do much more than just teach a curriculum around bullying and online safety and domestic violence laws and whatnot, that they're really a resource for students, for their families, for school administration, guidance counselors, and whatnot. That when we created the high school resource officer position 2 years ago, that we labeled all of our officers that are working in the schools as resources. It seems to be more transparent and more encompassing of the broad array of work that they're doing. We would recommend through this process that we develop a general order that more specifically spells out the SRO program, as well as incorporating the relevant changes from the 2020 Police Reform Act, solidifying a bit the role of the school resource officers, which I will just stress is not to be the disciplinarian of school policy and rules, but further to just promote relationships and healthy outcomes for our youth and be a resource, again, for the schools and for students and for families. We would like to increase communication between the police department and the principals and the superintendent's office and staff and parents. There was some discussion around confusion about the AWARE curriculum. The AWARE curriculum has been in place for many years, has been taught in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades. And at the beginning of each school year, a letter is annually sent home to parents indicating that the program will be taught. But we would like to extend that public notice to include a parent forum, as well as ongoing and regular communication between the police department and the superintendent's office, principals, and staff, and also incorporate our SROs a bit more into the professional development that's happening with the teachers, so that if they're learning curriculum related to racial justice and social media and bullying, that our officers with the SRO program are involved in that as well, and working together on the same background of training. In terms of looking at crisis intervention and mental health and substance use disorders and the services provided by the police department, we accept the Subcommittee on Mental Health and Substance Abuse Use Disorders recommendation for crisis intervention and mental health calls, and defer to Commissioner Childs, who is truly an expert in that area, and the recommendations that committee have moved forward with based on their interviews and information gathering. Also, we looked at the area of emergency management, the work being done with the police department, with the larger emergency management team, the community emergency response team, as well as training in the community, particularly with the schools and houses of worship around preparing for emergencies, and felt that the role of the police department currently as it stands with emergency management, particularly the work of the police department during our current pandemic, we recommend no changes to that. It's an appropriate venue and participation with a larger townwide program that's happening now. Lastly, we looked also at the handling of domestic violence cases. That actually was just written into our report. We have yet to flush out all of this in one of our subcommittee meetings, but going forward at this point, our subcommittee has read the department policy and the state law, which is included in our final report, and recognizes that domestic violence cases are some of the most unpredictable, volatile, and dangerous situations for a responding party to intervene, and at this time does not recommend changing that the police department be the primary department fielding those cases. We do have a domestic violence advocate that works within the police department. We have a domestic violence unit that consists of a sergeant, a detective, and our civilian advocate who manage the follow-up and ensuring that victims and their families are receiving the appropriate services, referrals, and support. But the 911 handling of domestic violence calls at this point, we do not recommend any changes. Outstanding work, again, is to review data from the follow-ups from the BHA survey, to work with the Teen Center. We also have there's a Citizen Police Academy that's run through the Brookline High School. We'd like to talk to them about their perceptions and experiences with police and incorporate that into the work that our subcommittee is doing.
Great, thank you, Casey. Before we go on, I want to use this opportunity to echo something that Casey said, and that is the absolutely wonderful support that we've received from town staff, and especially the police department. I mean, the police department are the targets of our inquiry, but we got nothing but absolute cooperation and support from them, from not just former Chief O'Leary, but other members of the police department, both police as well as civilian employees. I also want to again urge people to especially read this report. It's a lot of reading, but there's a lot of facts, a lot of very good information. And let me just throw out that you, or suggest that you read this from the standpoint of the question raised by the Obama 21st Century Policing Task Force. And that is, do we want policemen who are warriors, or do we want policemen who are guardians of our community and participate in social services and the other things that make it possible for us to have not only a safe community, but a just and healthy community? Guardian versus warrior, I think, is the underlying issue or question that people should just have in the back of their mind. So next we have mental health and substance use disorder. That's Elizabeth Childs, former commissioner of mental health in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So she knows a little bit about this stuff. And of course, she's been working with a number of other very impressive people in the behavioral health area. Elizabeth, tell us about your committee and then some of the recommendations you're going to be making.
Sure. First, I want to give a big thank you to all my fellow committee members, especially you, Bernard, for your leadership, and also to the generous contributions of experts who've helped inform our work throughout this process. And I've listed here the people that on this particular initiative that we worked with most closely, but certainly everybody on the committee had input. Bernard, Casey Hatchett, Michael Zurab as subcommittee members. And then our expert contributors were June Binney, Janice Kahn of the advisory committee, Annabelle Lane, Sergeant Chris Malin, former Chief Dan O'Leary, Lieutenant Jennifer Pastor, and Richard Shiola. And I can't say enough about how much they've contributed to making, moving our recommendations forward. I also want to just add one thing about that we really appreciate the members of the public who came to our subcommittee meetings, who listened, learned, asked questions, pushed us. We really appreciated that. Even some of you even tweeted about it. So we really valued your input. Our purpose was to identify opportunities for reforms to our police department so that each and every person who has a mental health or a substance use disorder or their family members who call the police for help are responded to immediately with the most highly trained officers that we have, who are trained in de-escalation, who are bias-free, and who can respond and get that person to the right kind of help that they need. What we want is to intervene in a crisis. We don't want to further the crises. We want to avoid a deeper penetration into the criminal justice system so that these individuals really get the help that they need. The sad reality of today is that because of the failures of our public health and mental health systems, our police officers are often invariably involved in way too many situations. It's not their shortcoming, they're actually filling the gap. It's the shortcoming of our public health and human services systems. So these appropriate interventions include effective, highly trained officers. They know resources, how to get the person to the right place. They have embedded within the police department a social worker that they can call on for expert involvement or advice or consultation. And we use the resources around Brookline to help us meet their needs. Brookline has a challenge in that we are too small to have our own freestanding everything, and we are too big to not have dedicated expert services. And so the department has creatively met this challenge by adapting best practices from around the country for Brookline's specific needs and our residents' needs. We looked at the existing resources. We looked at the Brookline Police Department's roles in responding to crises, and we looked for opportunities that we could improve services for individuals in our community who have mental illness or substance misuse. And we looked also at non-police alternatives. Some of the recommendations are not just for the Brookline Police Department, but they're for the whole community, our town, other town services, and actually community members as well. So our recommendations are that although 100% of our officers today are trained in de-escalation and crisis intervention team models, which is a best practice model, we recommend that we continue that training with any new officers, and that will require some funding. The current officers have been funded on a grant. We also train 100% of our dispatchers in mental health first aid, and that is unusual. Not very many cities and towns do that, and we would recommend we continue that practice. We have one full-time equivalent social worker in the department now who's embedded on grant funding. We would recommend that the town prepare to fund 2 full-time equivalents of social workers in the Brookline Police Department, embedded to go with the police when necessary. And we think that's the most cost-efficient way of getting more mental health expertise embedded. We spent a great deal of time working around the front end, the 911 system, where the police department collaborates with the Boston Emergency Services Team, known as BEST. This actually works fairly well, but there are clear opportunities to build on the successes and improve response. I would just remind people that crisis is a 24/7 problem. And today, the last and first, the remaining standing 24/7 crisis responder today is the police. How many times do you call your doctor or your psychiatrist or your therapist or your substance abuse counselor and hear, if this is an emergency and you cannot wait until tomorrow to talk to me, please call 911. So the idea that we can work around the police as part of that response team is not realistic. The existing system is built on an expectation that the police will be there and that they will respond in a crisis when they are the responder of last resort. Despite that, the real gap occurs with aftercare. Linkages are a problem, and we clearly need to increase urgent care capacity, walk-in capacity, non-traditional hours, community-based wraparound services. And this is not unique to Brookline. This is a problem that we recognize across the state. And I would refer people to a document that is appendix to our report, which is the Massachusetts Behavioral Health Care System Strengths, Gaps, and Opportunities for Improvement. This is a blueprint done recently in 2019 by the Manit Consulting Group. And it's followed up by the current administration's, the Commonwealth's roadmap for behavioral health reform. And this critical step, which is going to roll out over several years, will create a front door to treatment. It will help connect providers before there's a mental health emergency, and it will expand access to treatment and create community-based alternatives. Brookline has a real opportunity here to work with our healthcare providers who surround us in taking advantage of this new healthcare redesign. And I think we're well situated to do that. Okay.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Next, we have one more page. I'm sorry. I'll be
Oh,
quick.
okay.
We fully support the newly created homelessness task force, which you heard about from Officer Hatchett. Retention is something that I cannot overstate. We have some of the best trained officers in the country. We want to hold on to them. We want to keep them. It's a high return on our investment of training. But even more important, it's the continuity of the relationships that these officers have with individuals in our community that they know. Sometimes the police officer that has said hello to them gotten them a cup of coffee, talked to them on the street, is the person that knows them the best over years. And these relationships are critical to finally getting an individual to be willing to engage with treatment. Additionally, the relationships make a big difference when you have to connect somebody for aftercare treatment, because it's not, I'm the lieutenant and I'm calling you. It's, I'm Elizabeth and I'm calling Susie, and Susie knows me. And she says, of course, we're going to get this person taken care of. So those relationships really pay off for Brookline. We recognize dispatch needs there are opportunities there for improvement. And for the community, I think there are a couple things that the community can do. One is to remember that, as Rosa Brooks, who just recently wrote the book Tangled Up in Blue, said to Terry Gross on NPR in her interview, it's complicated. To remember, this is not, it's not a simple thing. It needs to be resolved, but to fix these problems will require all of us working together and not assuming that we're just going to dump in some magic fix and it's going to work. That's just not how things work. And the second thing is, when we're hearing about tragedies or outcomes, it's important to get the facts before people start to make assumptions about what happened. These are very complicated cases. And then lastly, I would just say the Police Reform Act actually does look forward to improving the emergency response, and we think that that's necessary. So we want to monitor what they're doing and give input to it and be prepared to implement improvements. It'll take a couple years. July 1st of 2023 is their expected report date.
Yeah. Thank you, Elizabeth. People should read this report because, like the others, it provides information that will sometimes shock you, or at least inform you of the complexities of some of these issues, and not just the problems in the current system, but also the inefficiencies. And our recommendations are intended to not just correct problems, but also improve efficiencies so that what we do is done at appropriate cost and quickly to the best result for the person that we're talking about. So next, Elizabeth Childs, again, Personnel and Governance. Elizabeth, tell us about this committee.
All right.
We've worked you pretty hard, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I had the privilege of chairing this subcommittee as well, and our members were Bernard Green and Paul Yee, two wonderful partners. We got expert contributions from Ann Braga, Michael Downey, Michael Keaveney, Dan O'Leary, and Lieutenant Jen Pastor. We could not have done this without them. We looked at the governance of the Brookline Police Department. We were charged with assessing that and including options, which you've already heard about in our universal recommendations. We were asked to consider what it would mean for the town if we withdrew from civil service for police officers and firefighters, and we'll talk about our recommendations for that in a minute. We were asked to look at recommending improvements in recruiting, hiring, and retention of our police officers, recommend improvements in promotions and training, recommend improvements in health and wellness of our police personnel, and to delineate considerations in governance and personnel that are related to the Police Reform Act of 2020, which does have significant impacts on this. I think it's helpful to just start with the context. There are some key facts here. Public safety is an essential responsibility of municipal government. It's in our Constitution, our Commonwealth Constitution. Brookline has a weak chief model, which actually means that it does have civilian oversight currently. There are 180 full-time equivalent personnel in the police department, and the budget of the police department, 92.3% of that budget goes to personnel. The Brookline Police Department budget is only 5.3% of Brookline's total budget, and it serves every single person in Brookline and people who don't live in Brookline, but work in Brookline or travel through Brookline. Reductions to the police department budget because it is primarily a personnel budget, would mostly impact younger, more diverse, recently hired officers, and would directly make it difficult for us to recruit, hire, and retain officers in the future. We do have a low salary structure, and it is already a challenge to recruit minority and women officers who are in very high demand by other communities around us, because everybody wants to fulfill the goal of a diverse police force. So with that context, these are our recommendations. We revised the mission statement, and we would recommend that it be adopted. We believe that the incorporating an oath to serve the U.S. Constitution should be included in police officers' swearing-in ceremonies. The leadership of the Brookline Police Department has been in flux, and Chief Morgan has been doing double duty, stepping in as an acting chief again. But we have some recommendations to stabilize that leadership as soon as possible. That will also help with recruitment, hiring, and retention. The Police Reform Act provides for a commission to take a deep and comprehensive look at civil service, and they will have recommendations for the whole state October 1st, 2021. And we would recommend, although discussing what to do with civil service, we would recommend holding off on making any decisions until we see what changes might be coming in civil service as it now exists. In the meantime, however, there are things we might do to, with home rule petitions, to increase our diversity, even if we remain within civil service. And Boston is in the process of doing that right now, and we can see how successful they are. We could implement a more robust police cadet program to increase diversity hiring. We would love to have our Brookline High School graduates stay and join the police department, and we think that we can do that. All personnel should have an exit interview so that we learn more effectively how to increase our retention of our officers, including chiefs and higher ranking officers. One of the pillars of President Obama's 21st Policing Reform agenda was to officer health and wellness. And the reason for that is that a hurt officer can hurt people. And so we want to expand and improve health and wellness programs, but that needs to be done with direct input from the police personnel that would utilize those programs. We believe the town should study all options to increase retentions and promotions, including resolving pay disparities. We believe we should implement any incentive that we can find for promotions, subsidizing the cost of studying and taking the exams, participating in study groups, formalizing mentorship in the department. We want our officers to advance and stay here. We need to focus on officer wellness. As I said, hurt people can hurt people. We think part of that might also be to develop a police-specific chaplaincy and counseling programs. This is an opportunity for our community to step up. People can help us from faith organizations and mental health providers who can really become expert in providing services to first responders who deal with trauma in their daily work. We also want to work with the public schools to make sure that we are addressing any bullying that's happening of police officers' children due to their parents' work. And this is an opportunity for us to also to educate our whole community around the stress that these families are under, and we want to support them as they live in Brookline. Maintaining our state certification and accreditation is necessary with the new Police Reform Act, and Brookline is way ahead of the curve on this. We're one of only 91 cities and towns in Massachusetts that are accredited, and because of that, we actually already meet many of the criteria for this in the Police Reform Act. It's no small feat to maintain accreditation. It's a lot of work, and we think we should continue to do it, however. And then as new rules and changes roll out from the Police Reform Act, we need to monitor those and implement them. Some of that will require record keeping. And then once the PCAC is in place, we would recommend that one of their first tasks be to do a full and comprehensive review of the police manual. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. And with that, in just a little while, we'll begin the public comment section of this hearing. And I'd like people to use the chat feature to raise their hand. And Devin Fields will call upon you, and you can make your comment, ask your question. Like I said, we're not going to have a back and forth, but we will respond to any questions that are asked of the committee. And after the hearing is finished, if there's time, we will have a discussion among committee members in response to the comments that we've received. Devin, could you go back to the table of contents of the slide deck here? Table of contents for the report. Okay, I'll try to remember what's in it. Oh, okay, great. I don't have to remember. Okay. I want people to know, how our report is organized. As you take this, what will probably be 180 something page report, there are sort of hacks you can use to sort of get into the report without reading all 180 pages, but rather reading certain pages and then knowing where in the report you want to go to get a deeper a bit of information. First of all, in the report is a foreword by me, because I'm the chair. And that foreword is basically my perspective on the creation of this committee and the task before us in the context of Brookline Police Department. That's my opinion, but I think it's useful just as a way of entry into the bigger report. There's the introduction is next, which is basically a summary of all of the committee reports. A focus on the way that you can identify what you're most interested in, and then go to the specific page of the report in order to get a deeper, do a deeper dive into the subject. Then the executive summary of the committee reports is basically the rest of the report. I'm sorry, it is the, what is that? Okay, forget what that is. Next, we have some universal recommendations, which I mentioned earlier in this meeting. And then we go into the subcommittee reports in great detail. And like I said, you can use the introduction as a way to identify where there are topics that you want to dig into deeply. And I apologize, but the subcommittee executive summary of the subcommittee reports is really a part of the introduction. And then after that executive summary, we have the summary of the committee reports within the introduction, not as a separate not a separate chapter. So the subcommittees are listed there that we went through just a while ago. So I think that should help you to get a hold of this really big report, plus many pages, if not volumes, of appendices. So with that, we want to start the public comment session. So, Ms. Fields, is there anyone who has raised their hand to speak?
Yes, I'd like to just give a reminder to all attendees. You're going to be using the Q&A feature to indicate that you'd like to make a comment or raise your hand. You'll have 3 minutes to speak. And if you're unable to stay with us for the remainder of the hearing, or you're not comfortable sharing your comments live, you can send an email to dfields@brooklinema.gov. The first person signed up for public comment is Ryan Black. Ryan, you've been promoted and your 3 minutes will begin when you're ready.
Yeah, and by the way, let me just mention, apparently the chat function is disabled, so it's not my fault, but I apologize anyway. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Black.
Thank you, and thank you, Devin. Ryan Black, he, him, his, precinct 6. So my comment is a driving theme of last summer's protest was a call to scale back the power and presence of police, and for communities to instead invest in people's economic and social needs instead of the police. So, if you may, to address the root causes of crime and despair. So I'm wondering how the members of the committee kind of square that with the fact that many of your recommendations would likely expand the police's budget. And what comes to mind is similarly is the task force found that within the Brookline Police Department, like patterns of racial discrimination in areas like traffic enforcement, as well as widespread recognition in the town of there currently being little to no oversight of the BPD. So yeah, just want to put that thought out there. I'll yield the rest of my time.
Great, thank you. We will respond to that, by email. We have your email address. Or at the end of the public comment period, maybe members of the committee would like to address that.
The next person signed up for public comment is Deborah Brown. Deborah, you've been promoted to a panelist, and you can unmute and share your video if you're comfortable. Your time will begin.
Hi, my name is Deborah Brown. I'm a town meeting member. And thank you for your presentation. I had a few questions. One, I'm looking at the overall level of FTE increases that you all are proposing. And not only do they seem significant, but they also seem fairly unrealistic given even what I've heard the chairman talk about in terms of, budget limitations. You've got three people in the schools. You've got 4 people in walk and talk. You're talking about adding social workers. That's, that was just what I caught. So that seems like an awful lot of FTE. And I'd like some explanation as to how you realistically expect the town to address this. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that I heard an awful lot about how this sort of mimics or parrots or is in line with President Obama's 21st Century Policing Report. But one of the things that it really talks about is when it talks about rethinking the role of police officers. I don't read it as saying that it is supposed to take on roles of responsibilities that extend beyond policing. So I would like to see that in some way addressed. I also am perplexed by how Obama's report calls for they've got multiple instances in language where they're talking about increasing trust, working closely with the community. They talk about community policing, and all of these things. When I hear about them, they seem to be targeted. Most of what I heard talked about tonight is focused on disadvantaged people. It's focused on disadvantaged people. And that for me is really problematic because, if you're talking about a walk and talk program, then why don't you have a community policing program that you have people walking in all sorts of neighborhoods? I mean, why is it so important to do it at BHA properties, understanding that the roots came out of, Bill Clinton's war on crime, war on drugs, pardon me. So I feel like there are ways that you have, in some ways, twisted is too strong a word, but I feel like that you've actually manipulated key portions of Obama's 21st Century Policing report. And that his point was, you really have to get comfortable with the people that you're supposed to be policing. And all I hear is a mission creep and an FTE expansion. Lastly, I heard nothing about how to punish police officers, how to punish police officers that hurt and mistreat, you know, I'll call them vulnerable populations, because that really does appear to be the group that most of this is focused on. So I know I rattled off 4 or 5 different points, but I would like some response, because as a practical matter, this, I mean, as a Black woman, it makes me uncomfortable to hear what you all are talking about. And it may feel all warm and fuzzy to you, but if you put yourselves in the shoes of people who are on the other side of this, and I heard all about the surveying, but my question is, how many of those people were people of color, and how many of them were under the age of, let's say, 55? And so that, you know, that even gets to the legitimacy of the analysis. So I have a lot of questions. I appreciate that y'all have done, you know, a fair amount of work, but ultimately it just reads like what you're trying to do is just perpetuate what's already here. And that's a disappointment. So thank you.
Thank you. And like I said, your questions that will specifically be responded to by the committee, either at the end of the public comment session or by email or other communication, but not, you know, directly right here.
Well, I think everybody should hear the response. I don't think it should just come to me. I think it should come to as wide an audience as possible. This is a,
we'll make it available to a wide audience.
You know, let's keep it public.
Okay.
The next person for public comment is John Van Scoyac. John, you've been promoted to a panelist. You can unmute and share your video, and your time will begin when you're ready.
Thank you very much. I'm not sharing video only because of a bandwidth issue. And is my audio okay?
A little scratchy,
Anybody
but
want to say yes or no?
It's you're cutting out a little bit.
Oh. Is this better?
No, it seems like your internet connection might be unstable.
John, why don't you come back a little later? Maybe it will improve.
I'm worried that you're not hearing me.
No, we can't really make out what you're saying. Try your cell phone. Maybe that's the way.
If you, yeah, I'm probably going to join you.
Okay, you're completely breaking up. So either call back later or use your cell phone, or, you know, email your comments to us. I mean, that's another way of doing it.
At this time, there are 37 attendees. We'd like to encourage folks interested in making public comment to use the hand raise feature or queue up in the Q&A, not the chat.
Okay. Why don't we use this time to respond to some of the questions we received from the 2 people who did make comments. Anyone have any thoughts on this? Okay, looks like Marty is either waving his hand or waving goodbye. Marty, did you want to respond?
Well, I've actually had my electronic hand up since the beginning of the meeting because I did want to say a couple of things after the subcommittee reports. And among other things, one is that I have to apologize to everybody, the committee and the public, but I have a hard stop at 7 o'clock for my wife's birthday. And my daughter's here to join us. So I'll be in gigantic trouble and might be in the custody of the police if I don't
Okay.
follow that hard stop. So that's number one. Number two is, as many of you know, and even some of the attendees, I bought a special T-shirt for this committee saying, "This ain't my first rodeo." I've been through this 1987 with Jeffrey Allen, 2009, a big committee looking at the procedures, 2010. I did the police commissioner bylaw for town meeting, but and that's only a short version. But the fact is that on this committee, I really want to commend and thank Bernard and the subcommittee chairs. All those iterations of my efforts, I've never seen people work harder than those people. And I really appreciate it, and I hope the community does. The third thing is, as I approach my hard stop, so you know I'm not going to go for long, I'm quite happy with the recommendation of what I'm calling the PCAC, and especially the liaison office, which, by the way, I don't think it made the report, but it was modeled after the idea of victim witness assistance in the criminal courts that are under the employ of the DA's offices. And that was part of the genesis of that idea. I think it will be a big improvement on our civilian oversight. And I do want to underline that the decision we made in 1987 was that the select board should be a civilian review board, and that's what it is. It has subpoena power. The only difference is it doesn't do the initial investigations. And with 6 to 8 complaints a year, almost all for rudeness, or more than half for rudeness, we just don't think we have the resources to have an independent agency, and we don't need it. And I'm very happy with the recommendations we're making. 2 more things that are related very quickly. I want to underline what Elizabeth said, because actually this kind of dawned on me, especially later in our discussions about the personnel issues, the retention issues. The department has made a great progress over my 45 years of involvement in getting a more diverse department. But the problem is that their recruits are very diverse, but they don't stay. Elizabeth has alluded to it. And what it means is, among other things, we lose experienced officers that know the town and get well trained. And also it means that we have very little diversity in the upper ranks. And I'm talking both ethnic diversity and gender, by the way. There's recent studies that, with all due respect to all our males present, that female officers have a temperament that is a little better suited to the guardian relationship as opposed to warriors. So in that regard, the last 2 things are, I do think we're going to have to look at the possibility of the pay scales changing, because I've done my own informal surveys the last few weeks with 4 officers that happen to be on detail on my street. And it's clear that we have an issue of losing officers and officers not taking the promotional exams. And part of that is because our pay scale is out of whack. And lastly, and Elizabeth referred to it, I think she talked about stabilizing the leadership. What's occurred to me recently, and I have mentioned it at a committee, at one of our meetings, but we haven't really discussed it much. I personally am convinced that if the town can convince Acting Chief Morgan to become a regular chief for his last 2 or 3 years of service, that would open up avenues to promote people and to help get some of the retention and diversity that I'm talking about, because that creates a whole flow of positions. So I again appreciate the committee and the work that's done, and especially the subcommittee chairs and Bernard. And I have 2 more minutes until, I'm sorry.
Okay, don't use it up.
I will review the tape and the transcript.
Great, thank you. Let me start off by taking a stab at a couple of the issues that were raised. First of all, with respect to 21st century policing, I mean, we really didn't try to track that program, that report. We referred to it, we learned from it, but this is a separate initiative in the Obama's 21st century policing report. And we do really focus on how do we make sure that the police develop good relationships with the community that they are policing. Let's see, mission creep was another issue. Well, yes, we're looking to make reforms in terms of the problems in the system that we have, as well as the inefficiencies in that system. And sometimes that means we do have to suggest hiring people to do the job. For example, data collection and data reporting. Now, we don't say that that has to be done in the fiscal year 22 budget, which is coming up. But this is something that should be on our radar screen for when we do have the ability to either fund a particular thing through our budget or grant money, which is always temporary, but still, at least gives us an opportunity to get funding while we get our budget into shape to take over the funding. Any other comments that people have in response to the comments from the audience?
Yeah, I'd like to make a quick comment, Bernard.
Yes, Michael.
With respect to Walk and Talk and the Obama 21st Century Policing report, I wanted to call everybody's attention to action item 4.2.2 on page 44 of the report, which says, law enforcement agencies should evaluate their patrol deployment practices to allow sufficient time for patrol officers to participate in problem solving and community engagement activities. And I think that's relevant because Walk and Talk is really at the heart of it. The idea behind the Walk and Talk program is that you have officers assigned to the same areas so that they encounter the same residents again and again, and build relationships with those residents so that they become known and they know the problems that often arise in those places. What often happens in many communities is that officers have to respond from call to call, that they're really rushed, that there's lots of people waiting. They've called 911 and they're waiting for the police to arrive. And so police really don't have time to actually talk to residents and hear what happened and try to think about, what problem, why did this person call 911? What can I do to try to prevent that from happening in the future? And so they rush. They don't have time to actually get to know residents and understand the problems that result in people often calling 911 repeatedly. So Walk and Talk ultimately is exactly about this. It's about officers having the time to get to know residents in the public housing authority in Brookline. It's not the only community policing program in Brookline. Officers are assigned to sectors repeatedly. Walk and Talk is a little bit different, but it's the same idea that if you have people who have enough time to get to know residents in the communities they're called upon for help, they get to know those residents, that's better than a stranger showing up when you're in a time of crisis. So, you can say the Obama report is wrong. A lot of people do. A lot of people say it's sort of wedded to this community policing idea that's outdated and that really, we don't want the police to be part of the community. We want the footprint of policing to be minimized. I think that's a valid argument to make, but I don't think a valid argument to make is that these aren't the principles of community policing embodied in that report, because I think that's really the kind of policing that the Brookline Police Department has tried to model. So Obama could be wrong. He's been wrong about some things, but I think we've been, the Brookline Police Department has been faithful to that particular promise within the report, which is ensuring that officers have enough time to get to know residents and to get to know that the community that they are called upon to assist. So yeah, I think there's a valid critiques to be made, but I did want to point out that that's sort of where this comes from.
Yeah, let me just add, if Walk and Talk officers were to disappear from Brookline Housing Authority facilities, police wouldn't disappear. There would still be police there. They just would not be police that have relationships with people in the community and who can help out in situations and receive tips from the community about crimes that are either threatened or happened in the past. So, I don't think anyone should think that getting rid of Walk and Talk means getting rid of police. It will be just like the policing of other sectors around town. I think we devised the program because we knew that public housing residents had particular types of issues that we needed to give extra attention to. I see that John Van Scoyoc is here by video. Does that mean that you have a stable bandwidth connection?
I sure hope it does.
Okay, so why don't you make your comment now?
I will. Thank you very much. And I apologize to everyone for the earlier difficulties. One of these days, I'm going to figure out how to do this from some room other than the kitchen. So far, I haven't figured it out. I have a few things I just want to mention, but before I do, I want to mention how very, very thankful I am for the work done by this committee, also by the Reimagining Task Force. It's been a real education for all of us, and a lot of constructive ideas have come from these processes. And there's a fair amount of overlap in terms of the recommendations, which I think is very encouraging. I think there's real grounds for some consensus recommendations between the two groups. I also want to say I appreciated Deborah Brown's comments very much. In that, I think she is quite correct to say that there is a fair amount of added FTE in the recommendations for full-time equivalent positions. We're in a time of budget stress, and it raises the question as to whether we're going to be able to reach the goals that are set out here in terms of the added FTEs that would result from these recommendations. I think she and I may differ in a friendly way as to whether adding to resources to the police department is the right way to go. I don't fear that part of it. I don't have a problem with that part of it. I do, worry that we're going to have to really work hard to figure out where the money's coming from to do all this, but it's worth trying the effort to try to find that money. And now here's my list of things that perhaps are covered by your report, perhaps are covered, but it's not. It's a little bit more in between the lines than overt, and maybe aren't covered. And I'll go down the list quickly. I think innovation from within is a very, very strong feature, and can be a very, very strong feature of the Brookline Police Department. I thought the presentation by Will Walker and David Pilgrim was one of the more exciting interviews that was conducted during this process. And I think it showed that there are officers within the department who have their own ideas. They're having their own conversations. They have their own vision of where policing should go in the future. And I would love to think that one of the results of this process will be a determination of how that can be encouraged to its fullest. Number two, in both the case of the task force and of this group, there was an effort made to determine whether traffic stops and field interrogations are occasions when there is inequitable treatment of people by the police department. I don't feel as though either group got a handle on how you can adequately measure that against the real, I guess you'd call it the denominator of who is the population that is being either field interrogated or stopped for reasons of some kind of traffic warning or citation. There are clear, misalignments between the demographic profile of Brookline and the demographic profile of both traffic stops and to a lesser extent, I think, field interrogations. But on the other hand, are those misalignments also there when you get a true measure of the demographic that the police are working within? And at best, I think that Reimagining Task Force just kind of guessed at the likelihood that the demographic that they're working within would also show a misalignment of those two things. And I'm not sure that this group came up with a clear measure of the demographic they're working within that would allow us to test that question. It's an important question to test. I'm just not sure we've adequately tested it in either of these processes. Next, I hope that this will lead to serious discussion and a decision on whether Brookline wants to migrate out from under civil service. I can't tell, but I haven't thoroughly read the reports yet, whether that comes across as a strong recommendation in either report. I'm not sure we are ready to say, yes, it should be strongly recommended or not. I do think we are well past the point where we have to decide. It's not worth talking about endlessly if we're not going to do it. Talking about it, just becomes another one of these kind of excuses for why things continue to be the way they are. So I think we need to reach a decision. Are we going to do this or not? And then pursue it and pursue it aggressively. It's not an impossibility. It's been done in other communities. And so let's figure out if we want to have it done for Brookline. Next, am I taking too long?
Just do your next question.
Okay, sorry. I heard prior police chief Lipson at one point in a public meeting raise his serious concern about a nationwide problem, which is the lack of attractiveness of entry-level policing to recruits. And I know you've touched on it, but I think it needs more attention because without figuring out how to solve that problem, we're going to continue to have problems of the quality of people who enter the policing profession. And last but not least, Bernard, you'll be glad to hear that, last but not least, this is a hard one to bring up, but I have to bring it up. I hear very little discussion in either of these reports of the role that police play as providers of security against mass shootings. And that's a well-recognized problem in this country. It's a well-recognized problem that has affected religious sites. It's a well-recognized problem that has tragically invaded our schools. And it's a known historical reality that whenever there are shootings, and especially when there are many shootings all of a sudden in one period of time, everyone wants to know, why don't we have better security at schools? Why don't we have better security at local houses of worship? And then all of a sudden, when the shootings are not so much in the news, people start saying, why do we have police in the schools? Why do we, send police, to sit outside the house of worship? There's a reason for this. And I don't feel it's been addressed in these reports as an explanation of why policing in schools, police presence in schools can sometimes be a very necessary part of prevention of possible plans by individuals to enter the schools and unfortunately to cause harm.
Okay, thank you, John.
I'm done. Thank you so much for your patience.
So I see that we have another person seeking make comment. Before we call on Mr. O'Neill, I want Elizabeth and Paul to prepare to answer some of the questions that John Bonscoio came up, and want other people to make notes of the other comments from Brian Black and Deborah Brown and see how you want to address them. We may have time during this meeting. With respect to benchmarks, I just want to say, and I hope Paul goes into more detail. The problem is we don't know what a benchmark is, and our proposal is to try to figure out what is a good benchmark. We did look at the traffic report from the transportation department, but it was it had some major flaws. It made it kind of useless as a benchmark. But you know, we recognize that we need to come up with one, and we have a proposal to do that. With respect to civil service, let me just say that we did an in-depth study, have options or identify options for the town. But as a practical matter, the new police reform law, it has set up a commission that's going to change the entire environment for civil service. And you know, we need to wait till that comes out in order to be able to adequately address, you know, where we go with respect to civil service. Mr. O'Neill.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I just wanted to say thank you for doing this work and volunteering and putting so much effort into the meetings. I especially followed Elizabeth's Charles' meetings with the mental health and abuse portion a lot, which was very interesting, and in the dialogue. And that committee specifically was fruitful, I would say. I gained a lot of information from that subcommittee specifically.
We were glad to have you and appreciated your input.
Thank you. I'm not going to say too much because I have not read the report yet. Until I do so, I'm not going to comment too much, but I will comment on lived experience. And I guess this will go to you, Brother Michael. So the Walk and Talk program, my lived experience with the Walk and Talk program. Yes, you have this relationship building. And I'm going to have to agree with Bernard and saying if that program were to leave, we would still have police officers there. The relationships that I've noticed with the Walk and Talk officers, minus the senior citizens, I'm talking specifically people of color, were negative. I can go into offline with you and describe personally what happened to me in regards to the Walk and Talk program. So I do agree with Bernard in a sense where we do not need, if that program were to leave, and I'm pretty sure if you guys were to recommend it in town meeting, were to vote on it, that money could go to social service or, add help. But I had a negative experience. I know others who look like me who lived in this town have had negative experience with the Walk and Talk program, with a negative, just to say, to this day, I will not speak to, I just give the officer a nod, you know what I mean? So I'll leave it at that. But I'm sorry, I'll just leave it at that. I had a couple other questions in regards to personnel and promotions and, who does, how many, who does the promoting in the police station and whatnot, body cam discussion, but I have to look at the report. But, Michael said something and it just touched me, and I felt I needed to speak up on my lived experience here in town. All right. Thank you for your hard work, and thank you, Devin, for keeping all this going. Devin, we see you. Thank you. We appreciate you.
Incredible. Yeah. Hey, Donnell, if you feel comfortable, I think it'd be helpful if you would share your specific experience with the committee. Only if you're helpful, only if you're comfortable.
Yeah, yes. Okay. Yes, I will. But see, then that gets them down to that personnel touchy situation. You know what I mean?
Okay. This is a select board meeting.
No, you know what? I'm gonna stay off of that because you guys called me out on that before. Okay. All right. But if you like, but not, give me a call, Michael. Whoever wants to know, give me a call. My number is 857-243-3602. Okay. All right. Very well. All right. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
The next person signed up for public comment is Deborah Brown. Deborah, you've been promoted to a panelist and you can unmute when you're ready. Your time will begin.
Hi, Deborah Brown again. And Michael, this is sort of in response to what I heard you talking about. You know, it saddens me to hear you talk about the good of a program and its needs. You know, I live in Coolidge Corner. You know, if I call law enforcement, guess what? They show up and they're friendly. I don't have anybody walking basically through my house on a regular basis. And I'm not sure that you get that there's a racial taint here that doesn't get to, you know, policing is supposed to be about problem solving. You know, as a guy way back when, Malcolm Sparrow, and he talked about how you have to prevent crimes. And it's like, and that's something I have not heard a whole lot about, is the prevention. And I mean preventing crime, not sort of shuffling the deck, so to speak, not ladling on more resources. But if you're saying that is crime greater at BHA properties and it warrants having somebody walking around, are you really preventing some sort of crime by being at the high school? Those are the questions that I think are important to ask. And so, you know, if it's prevention that we're after, I have not heard any kind of analysis today that will get me to a place where I go, whoa, this sounds a little bit like Malcolm Sparrow talking here about crime prevention and what that entails. The other piece is when I hear people talking about community engagement isn't a survey. It's not a one-off. It's spending time with people. It's holding forums. It's going door to door, which we can't do, but it is a long-term investment. I also, you know, when I hear about the whole idea of, you know, police recruitment and retention, and I'm going to be a bit of a provocateur here. Maybe it's a dying industry as we know it. Maybe it's a dying industry as we know it because people are beginning to think about better tools to address the underlying issues that lead to crime. Maybe it is an outdated industry, much like working in a steel mill. So I just wanted to put that out there. And I do want to say that, you know, in addition to, you know, really figuring out what problems you're trying to solve, that you haven't really done community engagement if you're summarizing it as one survey. But that policing has to extend to every neighborhood. And when so much of what I'm hearing tonight is shrouded around race and income, it makes me incredibly uncomfortable because part of what I hear you saying, and Michael, what I really thought I heard you saying was that Black people are criminals. Oh. Latinos are criminals. No, because the way you talked about walk and talk, that may not have been your intent. But if you go back and you listen to or have somebody else that doesn't look like you listen to what you said, you guys have been in a vacuum talking back and forth with one another. I came at this and I'm like, Michael, this. So I would implore you to think carefully about how your words hit other people. Because what you said, I was like, dude, it's got to be more expansive. It's got to be more nuanced than what you're describing. So those are my comments. And
okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Sergeant Hatcher, do you have any response? I mean, because she asked questions specifically addressed to policing as crime stopping for crime prevention versus like, you know, whatever else. I think it was more directed at you than anyone else.
Right.
Although it was directed at Michael, but I don't think that really hit.
I would like to, I'll respond briefly and then I'll yield my time to Michael to respond to that, those allegations as to his intent of his comments. The Walk and Talk program does an incredible amount of diversion in Brookline housing. To say that, you know, and just to backtrack, and Bernard, you addressed this earlier as well. We actually do have a walking beat in Coolidge Corner. So the comments that nobody is walking through Deborah's neighborhood is actually inaccurate. We actually have specifically a walking beat in Coolidge Corner. We have officers assigned to our 9 routes within the town of Brookline. We have officers assigned to specialty positions that, you know, work with, you know, and I'm not using the term patrolling or surveillance, but they're working with different communities within Brookline as well as different geographic areas. We have an elder affairs officer that spends most of his time probably on Center Street, where we have, you know, 2 large senior housing and the senior center on Winchester next door. And so we do have officers assigned geographically throughout our community to work with our residents, and Coolidge Corner does have a walking beat. Our officers, you know, are you know, work with residents on problem solving and addressing emerging crime problems. If they have concerns, they will work with their managers at their various 10 properties across Brookline, and then also work with our police officers to address those. And whether that's package thefts or, you know, like quality of life issues, they are reaching out regularly, day in and day out, to our officers. And so while that might not feel good to people who don't live there and are not requesting their services, that is the reality of what is happening with our Walk and Talk. They have very, very close relationships with many of the residents and are helping to problem solve before they have, you know, crime patterns and whatnot that are emerging. If a resident is concerned because they have kids that are possibly dealing drugs, right, like they will, you know, our officers will go and talk to them, and oftentimes it's you know, they're not doing what another resident might fear is happening, and they can, you know, they can mitigate that and talk to the residents, talk to the youth, and they're probably just hanging out. And Brookline doesn't have a tremendously high crime rate. We do have a high rate of residents across the town that are in need of services, and we get 65,000 calls a year for service from community members looking for assistance from our officers. And it's not just from Brookline Housing, but like our Sector 1 officer, our Sector 3 officer, Sectors 9, our Coolidge Corner, we do have officers that are working in Brookline Housing, and they are freed up to spend considerable time getting to know the residents and being more than just a revolving door of an officer that's responding in the time of crisis, during, you know, crime or a victimization, during a medical, or during another incident that they may be experiencing. And because of the historical fear and the history of policing with minority populations, having our officers establish relationships with residents in the good times helps residents who may be fearful of police feel comfortable reaching out in the hard times. And that is truly the goal of much of the work that our Walk and Talk officers and other officers are doing, is that if they can break down those barriers between residents and police and perceptions and fears during the day-to-day, whether that's a community service program, or they just see Officer Tim walking through Egmont Street and have a conversation, right? When something larger happens and something that's more delicate or more dangerous, they feel comfortable reaching out, and that's truly the goal. And it's not just in Brookline Housing, that is town-wide. And our town, our community, our department does spend a considerable amount of time focusing on community policing efforts.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Michael, I don't know, you were asked.
Yeah, I mean, I would like
Casey pointed towards you to answer, but
yeah, I would like to respond very briefly. I mean, I really appreciated what I heard from Donnell. I have Donnell's phone number, and so I will give him a call because I would be curious to hear what his experiences were like. I certainly do not believe that Black and Latino residents are criminal. That is really the opposite of what I believe, to the extent that I my remarks implied that, I'm sorry. I don't know that I said anything to that effect. I certainly didn't intend to, but to the extent that that was the impact, I apologize and I'll try to do better. I really came into this very skeptical of walk and talk. From our first meeting, actually, I said we needed to do a survey of residents of walk and talk to see how they feel about the program. And that comment was inspired by something I heard at town meeting last June, where somebody who grew up in housing asked that. They asked, have you asked the residents of housing how they feel about walk and talk? And we did that survey. I think we ought to do it again in the future and do it better. But we heard from residents of housing across demographic groups, including Black and Latino respondents, who were not seniors. The folks who responded to the survey wanted the program to continue. Not all of them, but the majority of them did. And so it's very helpful for me to hear the feedback of residents who grew up in or currently live in housing. And I really think they should be the ones who determine whether the program continues. That is fundamentally what I believe. I just haven't found evidence that they want the program to end. And to the extent that someone presents evidence that demonstrates that, I'm more than happy to advocate for that, since that's quite frankly what I came in thinking we would find. But that's
okay. Thank you.
I'll say thank you.
So, Devin, is there anyone else seeking to speak?
At this time, there are 35 attendees, and we have been encouraging folks to use the hand raise feature or Q&A if they'd like to make a public comment. There is no one indicating interest at this time.
Okay. Any further discussion from the committee? Okay, that means we have just a few comments that we need to transcribe and respond to. I'll give.
I do want to bring committee members' attention to a question in the chat. Does anyone know, or can you provide in writing the number of people of color who completed the walk and talk survey?
It was 18. 18 of the 70 provided their race, and it was not white, or some fill-in that I assume was white. Like some people wrote American or Jewish, and I'm counting those people as white. But 18 people wrote Asian, Black, or Latino. 12 were Latino or Black, self-identified.
Okay, is there anything else in the chat room, Devin?
Yes, there
Okay.
is a question about when the public will hear from all committee members.
Meaning, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Is there going to be an opportunity for all committee members to share feedback on this process publicly?
Okay, we can do that. Why don't we let Paul Yee respond to,
Specifically, Bernard, people are asking to hear from Raj.
Oh, want to hear some negatives. Okay, let me listen to Paul, or let's listen to Paul Yee first. He had his hand up.
Mr. Van Sawyer, he asked a couple of questions. Let me try to answer them as I thought I heard them. There was a question about he wasn't clear in his mind, perhaps, that either committee, the police reform or the reimagining task force answer the question whether or not the Brookline police are using traffic stops as an investigative tool. We did address that in the report, and the data doesn't show that the Brookline Police Department are searching vehicles by making traffic stops. So, for instance, we reported in 2019, there was 13,000 traffic stops. There was one non-inventory motor vehicle search. When we say non-inventory, that means when a vehicle is not towed, when a vehicle is towed, the motor vehicle has to be inventory. So this is an instance where the vehicle was not being towed, but there was a search. In 2018, there were over 9,000 citations or traffic stops. There were no non-inventory searches. In the year 2020, there was 3,400 citations or traffic stops, and there were only 2 instances. With respect to benchmarks, we did treat that and deal with that, I thought, pretty extensively. We do make a recommendation, and that recommendation is the best or most accurate benchmark is probably a windshield observational study or crash data study. And that would give us an estimate of the driver population in Brookline. With respect to mass shooting, I can't speak to anything that would be happening pre-prevention. I think that if there were to be a mass shooting during the event or post-event, the Brookline Police Department is part of a response team called the Metro Boston Active Shooter Hostile Event Response. It's called ASHA for short. There's a memorandum of understanding. The police would respond to the active shooter. Would respond to active shooters and all hostile events and casualties like terrorist incidents. And the Brookline Police Department is a member of that since October 25th, 2018. So I hopefully I answer those questions.
Thank you. I see that, oh, Elizabeth, looks like you're saying that you can answer some of the recruitment and innovation from within question.
What about Raj?
I can, if you want me to respond to questions.
Yeah, let's get your response and then we'll open it up to the committee.
Well, I'll follow up actually with, Paul also mentioned the school shooting issue. I just want to point out that the training of the Brookline Police Department includes 100% of the officers trained in tourniquet, stopping bleeding. And actually people may not think that is one of the most important things that we can do to make sure that people are fully trained in how to stop bleeding in any mass shooting event. And we are actually unusual. It goes above and beyond the state requirements for us to train all our officers in that. So that I would just mention that's one thing we already do. That's an on the grounds piece. On recruiting, I think John Venskoyak raised some questions about recruiting. I was just going to say the things that we recognize that are challenges with recruiting and diversity in particular are the civil service law does preferentially recruit for veterans and residents. And so therefore it doesn't necessarily recruit for diversity. So it's one of the challenges. It's one of the things about a home rule petition might be to actually ask to be able to do more diversity recruiting through like making people who have gone to Brookline High School but don't happen to live in town, making them available to be in the preferential pool to hire. The other thing I would say is that it's expensive to live in Brookline, and the residency requirement requires that people live in Brookline. So we know that our salary structure has to be competitive if we are going to recruit minorities and women in particular, as well as really anybody, but in particular, we are competing to recruit these highly qualified individuals, and we want them here. The morale is affected by the community response, the community attitude towards our police officers, and a community that values our officers, wants them here, recognizes their service is really critical. Morale is also dealt with by our police department being a place that really values training people in de-escalation and crisis intervention. So our officers are very sophisticated in terms of understanding what it means to be positive in your work. And that's important. And then innovation from within. John also brought that question up. I would say, actually, I think that's one of the strengths of our current Brookline Police Department and something that we can use to build for the future. And I would say innovation from within is very much what has happened. Many of the programs that have become part of the culture of the Brookline Police Department are state-of-the-art best practice programs that have been brought to the police department by officers within the department and then adapted specifically for Brookline's needs. Because a program that serves a metropolitan area, you have to adapt it for a community of 60,000. So, and a perfect example of this is the crisis intervention team model, which Sergeant Chris Malin and Lieutenant Pastor for the last 20 years have been building expertise in the department to the point where our department is now one of 5 in the Commonwealth that is a technical and training center for this model. And this model came out of a tragedy in Memphis in 1987 when a Black man was shot and killed in a housing in a housing authority housing. And law enforcement and the National Alliance for Mental Illness came together and worked with experts around the country to develop this best practice model. And our police have adopted it. So it's, and become expert in it. And people can debate, maybe we're ready for the next iteration of crisis intervention team and de-escalation, but I think it is something that demonstrates their commitment to innovation within our department, and we should build on that.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. So why don't we open it up to the committee members who'd like to make statements or raise other issues. I see that.
Sorry,
yes.
This is Devin. At this time, I do just want to bring committee members' attention to a few public comments that have come in, specifically asking for Raj Dahanda to address the group. There was also another comment that I didn't read that mentioned this attendee is halfway through the report and has been impressed by what they read, particularly the data supporting the subcommittee's reports. There are at least 3 or 4 comments requesting that Raj Dahanda address the hearing.
Okay. So why don't we do that? Okay,
all right.
So let's open this up to committee members who want to speak. And I guess the first person would be Raj Dahanda.
Yes. Thank you, Bernard. So I want to make my comments because I do not support many parts of the Police Reform Committee report. I've come to this conclusion based on analyzing what has happened from the beginning of this committee. Before I do that, I'll quickly walk through why I got involved in this committee work. As you know, I've lived in Brookline for 50 years, raised family here 20 years. I thought Brookline was idyllic suburb. During 70s, 80s, I also traveled vast amount of America, but did not experience racial bias. Then in 1993 at Coolidge Corner, when I asked a police officer to attend to a dangerous situation, he responded, "Why don't you go back to where you came from?" Really, think about that. That totally stunned me. And that too at the intersection of Beacon and Harvard and Brookline, bastion of liberal thinking. I thought if I were the head of the police and learned about it, I would have ordered a full investigation, personally spoken to me and the policeman and done something about it. That incident left a deep and a permanent scar on me and convinced me that there is serious difference between how Brookline police views people of color and its racist bias. There were a couple of other incidents, and I'm aware of other people who have had incidents and how Brookline police has treated them. So with this background and mindset, and having seen many brutal incidents around the country, as we all have, I was ready to do what I could to correct the misconduct towards people of color. misconduct by police. I learned with great excitement last summer when Brookline Select Board announced formation of 2 committees to reform the police to reimagine policing. I was so excited that I applied to be a member of both the committees. Soon after I joined the Police Reform Committee, I learned that Brookline Police Union endorsed you, Bernard, for your election. This made me think that you would be biased towards the police. I felt that you owe them a debt. I also see it's a conflict of interest. As weeks and months of the committee's work went on, I saw it play out at every turn. I know that I'm at odds with many other people who've spoken and who feel differently. As for the work of the committee, except for Ron Wilkinson's complaint form, I really cannot support it. The overwhelming concept has been to endorse the police. Yes, there are some feeble attempts to look into complaint policy, creating PCAC, but they all have put police bias written over them. More specifically, the Accountability Committee has recommended forming an advisory committee to review police internal affairs reports about citizens' complaints against the police. I don't agree with this recommendation. The committee made this recommendation without taking the complaints individuals have made against the police seriously enough and without conducting an in-depth exploration of pros and cons of other forms of accountability. The committee did not address substantive criticism of internal affairs process. Committee instead characterized these criticisms as being rooted in mere perceptions of unfairness. I don't believe forming an advisory committee to review complaints against the police will be effective for 3 reasons. First, existing police internal affairs process, which our recommendation leaves in place, is biased towards exonerating officers. I can testify to that. That is the experience across the country of the police investigating the police. Brookline is not any different. Second, the limited interviews we conducted of complaints revealed that the internal affairs reports do in fact on occasion unfairly favor the police version of events and discredit complainants in subtle ways. This may include what facts are left out in reports. It may include how conduct by police officer and complainants is characterized, highlighted, or downplayed. In summary, I believe there's evidence of substantial unfairness in the process that undergirds and validates the perception of unfairness. I say this not to cast aspersions on internal affairs officer. I have nothing against him personally, but to stress that we have more than just a problem. And I did not feel anywhere that we actually accept the fact that we have a problem. Third, an advisory committee that simply reviews internal affairs reports has no authority to conduct independent investigations. That will be unable to hold police accountable. It will not be able to get to the facts. Boston had a similar process and it failed. As many of you must know, it recently replaced it by an independent board that has authority and budget to conduct its own investigations. I believe that a truly independent investigation is better and more effective way to move forward, to move Brookline forward. I'm happy to answer any comments or questions. I know I'm the lone dissenter here, and So here I am.
This is Devin. I do want to bring committee members' attention to a comment in the Q&A from a member of the public who says, my comment is when Raj Dahanda is speaking, the chair, Bernard Green, and Marty Rosenthal are not present. That says a lot about this committee.
No, it doesn't. Okay. Marty left the meeting because he has another event, and I sometimes sit down instead of standing up. I would actually like to respond to a statement by Mr. Donda that I was endorsed by the Brookline Police Union, which is true. The background is that I would take my son to the Lincoln School, not the Lincoln School, the Lawrence School in the morning, and run into Janine McGuire, who is the crossing guard there. And she's a very friendly person and would always talk to people walking through that intersection at St. Paul and Francis. We got to be friendly, and she said, let me introduce you to my husband, who was Tom McGuire, who's the head of Brookline Police Union at the time. Tom and I talked. I mentioned that I had some issues with policing, but I'm willing to listen to you, Tom. And that's really the way I do things. I'm willing to listen to people, even if I don't agree with them. I was willing to listen to you, Raj, by pointing you to this committee. Tom McGuire was impressed by the fact that I listened. Apparently people don't listen much in the town. And he said, Bernard, I want to get my union to endorse you. I was running for a select board for the first time at that time. And I said, if you want to do that, that's fine. And they did. And I have no problem with that endorsement, and you shouldn't either.
So quickly,
so that's the background to that particular comment. But beyond that, other people can respond.
Yes, quickly, you didn't know me much before the appointment of this committee, but anybody who's watched the proceedings has noted that so many times you interrupt me, you don't want to hear from me, you want me off the committee. So I don't know that there's any credibility to your saying that you're happy to hear from me. And it is what it is. It
is what it is. Anyone else from the committee want to make a comment, or are there any other people in the queue who want to make comments or ask questions, Devin?
At this time, there are 28 attendees, and no one has used the hand raise or Q&A feature to indicate they'd like to make a comment at this time.
Okay. I'd like to have other members of the committee, if they want, to make some final statements before we end the hearing. And like I said, we will make sure that we accurately transcribe the comments that were made earlier in the meeting and provide a response to them, which will also be part of the public record.
Ronald Wilkinson has his hand raised.
Hi, Ron.
I just wanted to say, first of all, I am very glad, Raj, that you at least respect the work that I did to develop a civilian feedback form that would be deployed on social media as well as on the town website to try to get unfiltered comments from people around the town when they've had a police encounter. And I think that has potential, although I think that's a small part of everything that we're trying to do. The main comment I wanted to make is that, let me put it the Police Commissioners Advisory Committee, which is the closest thing that we're proposing for a civilian review board, that has seemed to be the limit at this particular point of what we're able to do, given that the select board are the commissioners, and select board has subpoena powers. And my impression is that I very much like the idea of independent investigating power, but my impression is that it would take more than just an appointment by the select board to make that happen. My understanding is that all the select board can do is appoint a standing independent committee to do that. And something more than that would require some sort of a change in the bylaws or whatever. But that doesn't mean that's a bad idea. But I think we reached the limit of what this committee is able to do. Number one. And number two, I do think that there is potential for that kind of advisory committee to make some positive moves. I'm very interested in what the Reimagining Task Force will say as an alternative to that, because they are looking at more substantive kinds of changes that can't necessarily be implemented immediately. So I'm very interested in that, because I do think the idea of independent review is very, very important for credibility and fairness. But this seemed to me the best we could do with the tools that we had. And I think that it can be effective if we work to make it effective. So those are my main concerns there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Any other comments from the committee?
Casey Hastert has her hand raised.
Casey?
Hi, I would just like to point out that, in my 22 years with the Brookline Police Department, we have been reforming and reimagining policing that entire time. The job that we do today looks very, very different than it did in 1998 when I joined the Brookline Police Department. This is the first time we've had this amount of community engagement around the work that we're doing. And sitting kind of at the front row of this work, I will say I greatly appreciate the work that's been done by our committee and the task force. I do think the recommendations that we're putting forward will reflect a fair and thorough process and will promote the work that has been ongoing in the police department, really to commit to fair and impartial policing practices in our department. I do believe that they will strengthen our relationships with our community, social service providers, and really build out services for those in our community that need those. And so I thank all of you for the work, the public for the tremendous amount of public input that we've received, and look forward to implementing the recommendations of this committee and moving forward to build out a more robust oversight through the PCAC and integrating the new Police Reform Act of 2020 into the policies and procedures. And again, I thank this committee for their thoughtful and fair approach to this work.
Thank you. Any other questions before we end the hearing? Elizabeth.
I just want to say what a privilege it's actually been to work with everybody on this committee. And I think there's one thing that has come out of all the work that's been so valuable, which is to remember that it's most important for us to do things that are good for Brookline. Brookline as a whole town, not to try to solve problems that are not Brookline, but to solve problems that are about Brookline. And it's easy to, with policing, it's easy to get into what's going on nationally, which is important. It's important context. I'm not denying that, but it's really about what works for us here in our town. And I think when people are committed to doing what's right for Brookline, it usually works out okay.
Great, thank you. So I think we should probably end the hearing at this point. Devin, could you make sure that the comments that were in the chat box are captured so that when we end the Zoom, we don't lose them?
Yes, they've all been screenshotted.
Okay, great. With that, I'd like to end this hearing of the Select Board's Committee on Policing Reforms and thank everybody for the work they've done, and thank the people who have made comments to the committee for their comments. And as I said, we will work to respond to those comments to the extent we haven't responded during this meeting. Thank you, everybody, and good night.